Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me again for another lecture in Core 103, Darwin and Darwinism. Before we get started, I just want to remind you, please sign up for a video presentation. You're going to be doing these presentations in pairs. There'll be a presentation once a week, as I said before. I'm going to upload those presentations on Monday night by 8 p.m. and then everybody will comment by Wednesday night at 8 p.m. and I will set up a wiki to facilitate that commenting. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will dive into a slightly shorter lecture than the one the other day. All right. So we talked last week about the value of reading things in the original. And so one of the things that happens when you're reading things in the original, even if it's whether it's a physical copy or a digitized version, I get a lot of the stuff that we read from Google Books, is that you can look at the book as an object and you figure out how the original document sort of encodes its own history. This is a version of what we call book history, which means the study of material texts. How are they printed, published, purchased, collected, read, modified, and what this tells us about the life of books and the worlds that they contain. So one class I teach, for instance, at USC is a class on Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, where we spend a bunch of time in the library looking at first editions and various versions of Lewis Carroll's works to try to figure out what we can tell us about how these books have been read and understood over time. For this class, when I picked up a copy of Lamarck's Zoological Philosophy that was digitized online at the Bioheritage Diversity Library, turns out it had this on the interior board copy of it. You can see these are the interior boards. So this is the inside of the hardback. On one side, it was apparently owned by somebody named Alan J. Nicholson. But the cool thing is, a later owner pasted his own sticker into it. And that later owner was Stephen Jay Gould, a very famous biologist. And as a matter of fact, somebody we'll be reading later in class. So we can say with some certainty that this copy that was digitized that we're reading today was the same copy that Gould used when he was talking about Lamarck, which is, I think, kind of nifty. Okay. So the other big question today, or the key question for today is, why do scientific discoveries happen when they do? What are the causes of those discoveries? And what we're trying to do is to get away of a model of science that on the one hand believes that science is simply a march of progress, that development's inevitable, that irons out all the disagreements and confusions and messiness of the process itself. And we're trying to look also at how the practice of science is wired into contemporary institutions. It's not just Newton sitting under a tree with an apple falling on his head. It's the particular, not just cultural, but institutional location. What did they have access to? What kind of problems were they forced to work on as conditions of their labor? So in the context of today's discussion, there are two institutions that are really important for the production of geology and evolutionary theory. The one we'll talk about in relation to Lyell is the Geological Society, which he helped organize and found in London in the 1820s as a newly developed forum for debating and developing geological theories. And over in Paris, the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, which was the French Museum of Natural History, where Lamarck was working as the sort of organizer of their invertebrate and vertebrate collections at the dawn of the 19th century. And as part of that task, recognized the challenge of figuring out how different species fit together and came up with an innovative solution to that problem. Let's start with Lamarck. So Lamarck was born in 1744, and his first major job was as chair of botany at the Jardin des Plantes. That was in 1788. That was the sort of National Botanical Garden of France. And so he was initially a plant specialist. But later on, he was promoted and moved over to sort of as head of the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, their natural history museum, which included all of these biological specimens, as well as becoming a professor of zoology. And as a matter of fact, Lamarck became a very, very famous scientist of his time and saw the need to define new sciences that could describe these forms of life. And one of the terms that he coined for this problem was biology itself. So Lamarck, we have to credit for inventing this term, which is the study of life, but he meant it more specifically the study of animal life, right? Vertebrates and invertebrates. Now, Lamarck is really important today, in part because he demonstrates the central role played by institutions in 19th century science. In other words, why these museums were not simply a place to look at nature, but drove the scientific investigation of nature. What was it that collecting all of these specimens from all over the world, either at the British Museum of Natural History, where they collected from the British Empire and its periphery, or the French Museum of Natural History, did the same thing in the ages of the French Empire, right? Gathered materials from all over the world, centralized them in one place where scientists could come and study them. But for somebody like Lamarck, the problem is even more finite and specific and logistical. How, once you start to gather thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of specimens, where do you put them? How do you organize them? In other words, Lamarck is recognized as having a huge impact on taxonomy. And taxonomy is the science of classification. It's figuring out how to organize different creatures within a hierarchy, right? Say, kingdom, phylum, genus, species, et cetera, right? Or another sort of taxonomic structure. But the point I want to make to you here is, for somebody like Lamarck, the problem of taxonomy is not simply conceptual. It is a problem of spatial organization. When you have all of these specimens, how do you put like with like? What constitutes similarity? And what is the proper sequence for different similar groups, right? In other words, the problem of taxonomy for Lyell or for Lamarck is also a problem of spatial organization. It's literally like Bed Bath & Beyond or a California cabinets problem. It's like, where do you stick the stuff? What is the system that tells you where the stuff goes, right? And as part of working through that problem of how to figure out what goes with what, he developed an entire theory about why you find certain patterns out in nature, how these things relate in nature. As he explains on pages 12 and 13 of the reading, which is the preliminary discourse from a zoological philosophy, it soon became clear that it didn't make sense to follow the practice of his predecessors and insist that invertebrates, in other words, those without a backbone, without a vertebrated backbone, and vertebrates who do have one, are entirely different forms of biological life and should be placed in separate areas of the museum. Rather, he figured out that if you studied closely invertebrates and saw how different species seem to develop increasingly sophisticated nervous systems and sort of cognitive processes, you could gain insight into what looked like a series of developments that pointed towards vertebrates. In other words, these two different groups of life kind of showed similar patterns, particularly when it came to the organization of increasingly complex nervous systems. Okay, so he puts this very explicitly when he explains the importance of his job to formulating the philosophy he's about to deliver here. As he puts it, "It has been my duty in the Natural History Museum to attend to the exhibit of the animals which I call invertebrates, on account of the abundant absence in them of a vertebral column." Now, if you think about it, what the vertebrae do is they're not simply sort of structures that repeat and sort of hold on to so your ribs and other things. The vertebral column is also very important as a sheath for your spinal column, right? And the nerves that run through the body. So by attending to its development, you're also attending to the way in which the spinal nervous system is developing over time. My research, as he continues, on these numerous animals, the accumulated observations and facts, and finally, the increased knowledge of comparative anatomy which I gained from them, soon inspired me with the highest interest in this subject. The study in invertebrate animals, those without a spinal column, must in fact be special interest to the naturalist for 4 reasons. 1, the number of the species of these animals in nature is much greater than that of vertebrate animals. In other words, the classification problem is bigger, but you have a lot more data to work with, a lot more to sort of study. 2, since they are more numerous, they're necessarily more varied, right? So there's more differentiation. They can tell you a lot. 3, the variations in their organization are much greater and more sharply defined and more remarkable, right? And here he's talking about the difference of everything from like a squid to a clam. 4, the order observed by nature and the successive formation of the different organs of animals is much better expressed in the mutations which these organs undergo in invertebrate animals, right? In other words, when you look at vertebrate animals, they look pretty similar because they've all got a spinal column, and so their basic body plan looks pretty similar. So it's hard to figure out what's more and less sophisticated or developed in terms of its nervous system. But that recedes when you look at invertebrate animals, where there's such a vast difference between some of them that have no nervous system at all to some that have extremely complex ones, right? because there's so much variation and so much distinction between them. Moreover, Lamarck continues, the study of invertebrate animals is more fertile in helping us to understand the origin of organization in general, in animals in general, with its complexity and its developments that could possibly be the case in more perfect animals such as vertebrates, right? So invertebrates give us perspective and enough data to theorize an overall system of development within which you can place vertebrates at the end. I hope that makes some sense. Okay, so this is a shot of the present day interior of the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle. And what I want to emphasize is, if you look at the sides, you can see all these little cases. And in all of those cases are a series of specimens organized through their system of relation, their taxonomic relation. So again, the spatial organization of this museum reflects the theory of development, right? Post-Lamarck and post now Darwin, a theory of the sequence of development and how you should classify organisms on the basis of that. It's important to recognize that a space like this is not a neutral space. It's actually an expression of sort of imperial expansion, the capacity to send out navies and explorers and everything else, to also colonize other parts of the world, to sort of subjugate them and then use them as the grounds upon which to gather specimens and centralize them back at the center of empire. So for both Britain and France, these exhibitions working collections, they're important to scientists, but for the nations, they were also an exhibit of imperial power. And they were also understood to secure that power by giving the metropole, the center of empire, the knowledge to control nature, to control the periphery. Okay. To back up or step outside for a second, in relation to Darwin, Darwin didn't go on the Beagle voyage innocently, because the Beagle voyage was in fact a cartographic expedition set up by the British Navy to chart unknown waters. And the whole point of doing that was to expand their naval power. So in some sense, Darwin himself, in this very famous voyage of the Beagle, was sort of working alongside, and what some might argue, even possibly in service of empire, because he was an accessory to this project of learning the world in order to sort of master it for the British. For the French, for instance, another really important sort of trove of materials that they gathered were in Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and to Cairo, which they ransacked. That's why, you know, Cleopatra's Needle is out in front of the Louvre in Paris today. And a lot of the specimens they gathered, especially the historical specimens, were gathered from raiding things like Egyptian tombs. Okay, so that is sort of Lamarck's generalized explanation for why we should look to invertebrates. It's only when we get to chapter 7 that he turns to the thing that he is most famous for, which is his theory of evolution. Now, when Lamarck started to try to arrange all invertebrate animals in a continuous series as a kind of scale of being, right, a chain of being, he noticed there was a problem, which is there were big gaps. There were lots of breaks basically between the different rungs. And so even though he had a sense that over time, all creatures were evolving to increasing mental complexity, and that was a linear development, so that if you get like almost think of it as like an escalator, you get into the bottom step, and it kind of keeps carrying you up to increasing complexity, a bit like also Milton, right? And Milton's theory of evolution towards a greater possible spiritual refinement. He noticed there are breaks. And so the problem he foregrounds is, how do you explain the fact that it's not continuous, that there seem to be these big discontinuities or breaks? As he puts it on page 107, this well-ascertained fact may throw the strongest light over the actual order followed by nature in the production of all the animals that she's brought into existence, right? In other words, the fact that there seems to be a progression in mental development. But it does not show us why the increasing complexity of the organization of animals from the most imperfect to the most perfect exhibits only an irregular gradation, in the course of which there occur numerous anomalies or deviations with a variety in which no order is apparent, right? What he's asking is, why are these breaks in the scale of being? Where do these irregularities come from? If I believe in this overall evolutionary progress, what causes disprogress? What causes disorder within this system? It continues on. Now, in seeking the reason for this strange irregularity and the increasing complexity of animal organization, If we consider the influence that is exerted by the infinitely varied environment on all parts of the world on the general shape, structure, and even organization of these animals, all will be clearly explained. In other words, looking at just their mental development doesn't do it. You have to combine a look at that progress with an attention to the environment within which organisms develop and exist. He continues on. It will in fact become clear that the state in which we find any animal is, on the one hand, the result of the increasing complexity of organization tending to form a regular gradation. In other words, the kind of mental development over time, increasing sophistication of the nervous system. And on the other hand, of the influence of a multitude of various conditions ever tending to destroy the regularity and the gradation of the increasing complexity of organization. What does he mean by that? He clarifies. I must now explain what I mean by this statement. The environment affects the shape and organization of animals. I'll say it again. The environment affects the shape and organization of animals. So if there is a linear development towards sophistication, on the other hand, environments are quite varied. And if organisms respond to distinctions in environment, they're going to develop in very differentiating ways, right? Rather than on the same path, say the difference between like living in a desert and living in a maritime or marshy environment is going to cause a big divergence in character rather than movement along the same line. As he goes on to say, that is to say that when the environment becomes very different, it produces in the course of time corresponding modifications in the shape and organization of animals. And he continues on, it is then obvious that a great and permanent alteration in the environment of any race of animals induces new habits in these animals. So what Lamarck's actually theorizing is two kinds of evolution interacting in uneven ways. An overall development of progress on the one hand, and a response to environment on the other that pulls organisms away from that linear line of development. As he goes on to say, now if a new environment, which has become permanent for some race of animals, induces new habits in these animals, that is to say, leads them to new activities which become habitual, the result will be the use of some one part in preference to some other part of their body, and in some cases, the total disuse of some part no longer necessary. In other words, Lamarck is saying, by continued use of new habits, for instance, the classic example is a giraffe reaching to try to eat sort of leaves out of the trees. Some parts of that an organism are used more, like the neck will stretch and the muscles for the neck will stretch. Other parts might be used less. For instance, that would explain the appendix or the spleen, organs that seem over time to fade away in certain lineages. Okay, so continuous organization is caused by developmental faculties like an escalator, but discontinuities in that process are caused by another force, what we now call Lamarckian evolution, or the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So what does Lamarckian evolution look like? It is one, environment, there's a distortion of the regressive order, which shows that it's there. Two, the change in environment, either by the environment shifting in terms of climate or conditions, or by organisms moving into new environments, changes the habits of those animals. Three, that environmental change in habits leads to the, quote, use of some one part in preference to another part, and in some cases, the total disuse of some part no longer necessary. And four, these acquired modifications are preserved by reproduction among the individuals in question. They are passed on and finally give rise to a race completely distinct from that in which the organism have been continuously and environmental favorable to their development. Okay, and the inheritance of acquired characteristics acquired by habit, changing the shape of the body, and then passed on to a subsequent generation. The thing I really want to drive home here is Lamarck is most famous for this version of his theory, but actually for him, it's a kind of a kludge. It's an attempt to fix the fact that his bigger theory, the one he really cared about, mental organization and mental development, didn't seem to account for everything. It's sort of like, if you know Einstein's cosmological constant, which he sort of came up with just because the rest of his theory wasn't quite working. It was just kind of a way to like make the whole rest of the system work. But it's the only part of his theory that's really persisted as sort of a core interest in the history of science. Okay. Now, what is it that's happened in Lamarck's analysis to the scale, the great chain of being, the scala non-serie? Well, what's happened is it's missing some rungs, right? It's kind of falling apart. There's pieces left, but the overall progression doesn't look as continuous as it used to. Now, Lamarck moves on in this account to provide various examples of organisms that show this response to environment, both plants and animals, for instance, right whales. But we're not going to dive into those examples right now. What I do want to focus on briefly before we move on is the way that Lamarck then rounds around and summarizes the sort of way where this kind of leaves us as a sort of theory of nature. As he puts it on page 126, these are some examples. The Ranunculus aquaticus, which is a plant that seems to be partly evolving from an aquatic plant into sort of more landborne plant responding to sunlight. The Olm salamander, which seems to have like lost its eyes and sort of visual acuity because it lives in a dark environment. So it's this example of the disuse he was talking about. But on page 126, he summarizes the distinction from the old way of thinking. The conclusion adapted hitherto, in other words, how people have thought until now. Nature, or her author, in creating animals, foresaw all the possible kinds of environment in which they could have to live, and endowed each species with a fixed organization and with a definite and invariable shape, which compels each species to live in the places and climates where we actually find them, and there to maintain the habits which we know in them. In other words, the previous understanding, which is reflected in Paley, is that every individual creature was created perfectly adapted to a specific environment. The creature doesn't change, nor does that environment, right? So nature foresees all eventualities, God foresees all eventualities, and programs it all into the creature. By contrast, Lamarck says, my individual conclusion is that nature has produced all the species of animals in succession, beginning with the most imperfect at the beginning of time, or simplest, and ending her work with the most perfect. And he does not specify this here, but in his account, simple creatures are constantly being spontaneously generated. The sort of most simple animals constantly kind of originate. So even if over long periods of time, some have evolved to become things like people, we still have very simple ones because that sort of spontaneous creation is still happening. Things are still getting on at the beginning of the escalator and sort of rising up the level of progression. As he continues on, these animals have spread at large throughout all the habitable regions of the globe. They move around. They don't stay in the same environment. And every species is derived from its environment and its changes, the habits that we find in it, and the structural modifications which observation shows us. So besides the nervous system, everything else is an adaptation to the change in environment caused by moving around or perhaps by changes in the environment themselves. All right. Now, he goes on by showing sort of his system of classification on the basis of this theory. It's a sequential order, right? So you have the Roman numerals showing the progression. So as you move through the Roman numerals, in theory, you're moving up that increasing level of progression. But there are certain branches out, right? So the stages on the right are the stages articulated by first stage, second stage, fifth stage, sixth stage, stages that are defined by sort of the overall process of development. But then within it, you find differentiation based on the environment. So fishes versus reptiles, right? Sea versus land, birds versus mammals, right? Some take to the air, some stay sort of terrestrial, right? And that causes that kind of differentiation of plant in his theory. The importance of reading a table like this, and this is why it's good to look at the original, is it's kind of like a mapping of Lamarck's mind, right? He has to visually present on the page the way he sees nature being organized. So to go back to Daston and the importance of historical epistemology, what we see in such tables is, quote, the history of the categories that structure our thought, pattern our arguments and proofs, and certify our standards of explanation. And that history can be traced if you follow the way tables like this evolve all the way from something like Lamarck to present day biology books that aren't organized the same way. It's like that exact sort of picture of the categories that structure our minds. So I want to give two final notes on Lamarck. It was in the 19th century, it was tradition within the French Academy of Sciences to provide a eulogy when one of its members died. And in that eulogy, the eulogizer, the person doing the eulogy, was supposed to reflect on the other person's work. Well, it turned out Lamarck had a rival, and his name was Georges Cuvier. Cuvier was the other most sort of preeminent scientist of his time, but he absolutely hated Lamarck and disagreed with him on about everything you could. And so when Lamarck died, Cuvier leapt at the chance to give Lamarck's elegy. And this is what he said, among other things, quote, A system established on such foundations, on the foundations Lamarck gives, may amuse the imagination of a poet. A metaphysician, a philosopher, may derive from it an entirely new series of systems, but it cannot for a moment bear the examination of anyone who has dissected a hand, a viscus, or even a feather. In other words, Lamarck was a crazy fraud, right? This eulogy had the impact of not just discrediting Lamarck, not just turning into kind of a laughing stock within the French Academy. It had an even more consequential effect of discrediting evolution itself and any theory of evolution, not just Lamarck's, for decades. Turns out France was one of the last sort of European countries that translated Darwin's Origin of Species into French, right? One of the last languages translated into, and the reason was because when Darwin came out, people thought, oh God, not another disciple of Lamarck. Cuvier put pain to Lamarck a long time ago. Why should we pay any attention to somebody like Darwin? I give this example because it shows how science often works in practice, right? The success of a given theory isn't simply a product of its merit or how accurately it describes the world. It is also derived by the support it receives or does not receive from other scientists. Sometimes whether or not it succeeds for a while or not has to do with whether or not they have good friends in the academy, other people who can vouch for it and advance it. A great example of this is Oswald Avery, who discovered that DNA contained genetic information about inheritance way back in 1944. But because he did not have sort of advocates within science, nobody really reacted. Nobody took him seriously until Watson and Crick decades later, right? It's not that he wasn't right. It's simply that it just, for various institutional and personal reasons, was not sort of picked up and run with. Okay. Now, the second thing I want to point out about Lamarck, and then we'll do Lyell really briefly, is that over time, not only has Lamarck's reputation been rehabilitated, but the idea of Lamarckian evolution has been given a second look. And as a matter of fact, today, something that looks a lot like Lamarckian evolution is a huge area of research in the natural sciences. What I'm talking about is epigenetics. Epigenetics is the theory that beyond the gene level, beyond the level at which genes encode information, we are able to, through interaction with the environment, transmit some sort of information to other generations that registers a reaction to that environment and changes the way they develop and behave. The classic example, the one that's been best proven, is methylation of DNA. Methylation of DNA means the sort of addition of methyl groups to certain segments of the chromosome. That doesn't mean it's changing the actual genetic code. The code stayed the same, the A's and the C's and the T's and the G's in exactly the same spot. What's happening is those methylation sites change how enzymes read those stretches of DNA, with what frequency at what times, and that controls expression, and that controls development and everything else, right? And these methylation patterns can be picked up by a parent and then transmitted to offspring, and actually can be transmitted through multiple generations. So it's an example of the inheritance by a later generation of an acquired characteristic, in this case methylation, with consequences for behavior or physiology, development, phenotype, et cetera. Okay, so Lamarck wasn't crazy. And when we get to Darwin, we'll talk a little bit how much Darwin actually saw value in Lamarck's theories, and in some ways proposed Lamarckian theories of his own. All right, on to Charles Lyell. So Lyell and Lamarck were very different. Lamarck was born from a working class family. Lyell was not. He was born in 1797 into a wealthy Scottish family with a large estate. He then went to Oxford and studied under a conservative geologist named William Buckland. Buckland was a major natural theologian, and he explained most of what one could see in terms of fossils within the record, in terms of strange deposits, in terms with reference to the Bible. Buckland, for instance, was a big advocate of the theory that the biblical flood explained why you find fossils of things like mollusks up in the Swiss Alps. His argument was it's because when the flood happened, it pushed all that stuff up into the Alps. Okay, I'm simplifying a little bit. That's basically where it came from. Lyell became a secretary of the Geological Society in London in 1823 at a relatively young age of 26. And he immediately set remodeling it on the basis of the French Academy, professionalizing it, pushing out sort of amateur people who didn't sort of practice sort of strict, hard geological science in the way that he thought one should, and sort of cultivating more rigorous science from it. As part of that, he was sort of the center of geological practice in Britain, and in 1830, he started to publish his Principles of Geology. a landmark work in the history of geology, one that is referenced in pretty much every sort of geology survey today, and had a tremendous impact, not just on geology, but Darwin's own thinking. Darwin was an early disciple of Lyell, and as a matter of fact, early in his career, he wanted to be Lyell. He wanted to be a geologist, not a biologist or a botanist. We'll talk about that a little more later. It also made Lyell not just famous, but quite a bit of money, and secured his ability to sort of do the geology for the rest of his life. Now, when Lyell was writing, there were a bunch of background theories he was responding to. There were various versions of catastrophism, including volcanism and Neptunism. Volcanism was the idea that most of the big changes that happened in the history of the Earth had to do with massive volcanic activities of some kind, eruptions, lava flows, things like that. Neptunism, on the other hand, had to do with transformations in water. So theories of catastrophic flooding were like versions of Neptunism, but they also included things like heavy sedimentation at the bottom of the ocean, compaction, the possibility that different chemical reactions at the bottom of the ocean floor could change rock. Within all of that, though, there was James Hutton's uniformitarianism. Hutton was convinced that, hold on one second, got to attend to something. We'll be right back. All right, back together. Go back to screen share. Sorry, there's gonna be a little bit of noise in the background. My apologies. The lecture is almost over. Hopefully, I'll be able to talk over it. Hutton was really, really important as a theorist of geology, because Hutton assumed that the Earth was not simply a stable entity, but rather a system. He believed that all rock transformed into other forms of rock. Over vast ages of time, sedimentary rock would sink down deeper into the Earth, and under heat and pressure would transform into other forms of rock, like granite, or other forms of metamorphic rock. Those might be exposed over time and do processes of erosion, break down again, and form into things like sedimentary rocks. In other words, he imagined this circular system in which things were constantly processed, sank down, and rose up. And as he put it, and he realized that for that to be happening, it would take vast stretches of time. As he put it very famously in his own work, we find no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end when we look to the geological record. Now, Hutton's work was considered radical at the time and not adopted by many. And one of the big reasons, he's writing in the 1770s and 1780s, one of the big reasons is most people were committed to a biblical timescale. In other words, they believed the Earth was as old as the Bible said it was, and the Bible said the Earth was 6,000 years old. So they dismissed Hutton's vast scales of time without any evidence of a beginning or end in the geological record, on the basis of the fact that it would be much longer than 6,000 years if it were so. Lyell took this insight and realized this is sort of the core for his argument. And he developed Hutton's theories into a more robust theory of what we now call uniformitarianism, the belief that small changes over vast periods of time lead to vast changes. The sort of key argument for that Lyell made was that, for instance, erosion, given enough time, could carve an entire mountain, and could whittle a mountain down into a hill. Or that given enough time, entire continents, if they're rising only millimeters a year, could rise out of the depths of the ocean and form further mountains. However, to make that true, you would need vast amounts of time, far more than 6,000 years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. So the question is, how do you make a case like this for deep time? Okay, and I'm going to go on to answer that in a second. But one thing I want to highlight here is the vast scales of time that Lyell was able to sort of successfully argue for and convince some people were kind of necessary to explain what we see was sort of the backdrop for Darwin's own thinking. Darwin took the first volume of the Principles of Geology with him when he went on the Beagle voyage, and he picked up the second volume with him once he was in South America. So Lyell was very much in his head. These theories were percolating as he looked around during the voyage and thought about what he was saying. We'll skip this Lamarck question really fast. We'll go to it in 1 second, but as Lyell puts it, the problem of explaining and arguing for these vast periods of time is very difficult. With a short time scale, the attempt to try to explain something really big and sort of imagine this deep past immediately assumes, he says, quote on 79, he says, the air of a romance. In other words, it sounds like something out of the Arabian Nights or like a myth or a legend, these vast changes that might have been happening. Now, the next question I want to turn to, though, beyond sort of the argument for uniformitarianism, is this little idiosyncrasy in the way that he develops his argument in the Principles of Geology. So the first volume is taken up with immediate evidence that these sorts of changes have existed. For instance, he points out, and he has a picture of it at the front of the Principles of Geology, that there's a temple in Serapis in Greece where you can see that there are barnacles who have attached themselves to columns in these ancient ruins that are now 8-10 feet above the ocean, right? Have risen up into the air and they're above the ocean. That can only be explained, he says, if the temple was built at one time on the land, if that land then somehow sank far enough down so those columns were underwater, so barnacles could grow on them, and then there was a reverse motion whereby those columns came back up. And because he knew that the columns, they knew when Serapis was built, right, roughly 2,000 years earlier, he said all of this must have occurred, these 6 or 8 or 10 feet of movement down and then back up within about 2,000 years. He says, if that can happen in 2,000 years, imagine what might be achieved in 10,000 or a million. After in book 1, he kind of makes this argument. In book 2, he takes a very strange turn. He spends the entirety of book 2 laying out Lamarck's theories and systematically trying to destroy them. This raises a big question. In this multi-volume work on geology, why does Lyell devote the entire second book to an attack on Lamarck? Well, there are at least 2 good reasons for this. One, Lyell recognized that in these sort of gradual changes over vast periods of time, he was describing something that sounded something like evolution, just evolution of the land, and he probably didn't want his theories to be associated with a discredited figure like Lamarck. Thanks to Cuvier's demolishing Lamarck's reputation, Lamarck was considered radical and weird and kind of crazy, and he didn't want to sound like he was spinning another theory like that. But the other good reason that he does this is because Lamarck's theory of evolution of organisms and more complex organisms messed with the way that Lyell wanted to argue for his geology. A core argument for Lyell was that to figure out how old rocks are, one of the key insights we have is what are the kinds of fossils we find in that sedimentary strata, right? If you're looking at sedimentary rock, you locate them in time by identifying what sorts of organisms are fossilized there. And certain organisms are fossilized at one point in time, other organisms somewhere else. That, according to Lyell, is something you can really count on when you're trying to think about how old things are and set them in relation to each other. But if Lamarck is saying things are constantly evolving and restarting and starting over and evolving into more complex things, it would give you no confidence that you could say that happened at this time because it has these kinds of creatures, and that happened at this time because it has these kinds of creatures, because in principle, they're evolving into each other. At least one is evolving into the other, and you can find them all sort of maybe next to each other in principle. But there was a huge irony to this. In engaging Lamarck at such length in his second volume, Lyell was in fact probably the most responsible for spreading Lamarck's ideas and popularizing them in England. So Lamarck had been discredited by Cuvier, and as a result, his work wasn't widely published in English, it was not generally read, right? Which meant that most people were kind of ignorant about the ins and outs of Lamarck's argument. But Lyell wrote a bestseller, and he gives the whole book basically to Lamarck, even if he's critiquing him. He lays out Lamarck's arguments and then disagrees. So the effect is accidentally to kind of promulgate Lamarck all over the place. And by reading Lyell, a lot of people became big fans of Lamarck's theories in the United Kingdom. Okay. I want to read this passage from Lyell about the idea of a first cause and his disagreement with Lamarck in book 2, because it really identifies what's so strange about this moment in the history of science and the thing that Darwin had to challenge. As Lyell puts it, quote, "The theory of the transmutation of species, considered in the last chapter, in other words, Lamarck's theory, has met with some degree of favor from many naturalists, from their desire to dispense, in other words, get rid of as far as possible, with repeated intervention of a first cause. As often as geological monuments attest to the successive appearance of new races of animals and plants and the extinction of those pre-existing." In other words, he's saying a lot of scientists are uncomfortable with the idea of the repeated intervention of a first cause. In other words, special creation, independent creation by a God over time of different creatures. What he's saying is when you look at the geological record, what it looks like is some species exist at one time that don't exist at others. Where did those other species come from? Well, the theory that we've generally run with is that God came in and created new species at another time and let the other ones go extinct. And that successive intervention of a first cause, right, the causation of a designer coming in and intervening, in other words, is something that a lot of scientists are uncomfortable with, okay? Lyell comes up with his own version of a theory, which is that under certain conditions, certain creatures will kind of spring into life, right, with or without the aid of a god. And as those conditions, environments change to be inhospitable, they will necessarily go extinct. But the point I want to make to you here is, it was easier for somebody of Lyell's generation to believe that God was constantly creating new creatures than it was to accept the idea that one creature changed into something else, right? In other words, literally, Eden happening over and over and over again made more sense, even as most scientists, even if they're a little uncomfortable with it, than the idea of evolution, that something like an aardvark could turn into a bear or a bear into a whale, right? To them, that sounded really crazy, particularly because with their sort of Christian background, they've been taught to kind of believe that something like special creation by a God could exist. Okay. And this is the sort of the challenge that Darwin faces in arguing for a theory of natural selection. But Lamarck makes a serious argument against the theory of evolution, against specifically Lamarck's theory of evolution, one that will remain very serious, a very serious challenge for Darwin. And that is the, quote, limits of variation. Lyell goes on to argue that in these cases, and he's talking about cases where you could see some change of creatures. For instance, when you breed dogs, you seem to produce slightly different dogs, or you could breed certain kind of plants and they would sort of change kind of different characteristics if you selected a certain way. He says, in these cases, we find that we soon reach certain limits beyond which we are unable to cause the individuals descending from the same stock to vary. So in other words, you can breed a sheep to look a little bit different to a certain extent, but at some point you can't change it anymore. While on the other hand, it is easy to show that these extraordinary varieties could seldom arise, it could never be perpetuated in a wild state for many generations under any imaginable combination of accidents. They also have plenty of examples of domestic species when they went back to nature or were left alone, will revert to something that looked like a sort of simpler, older, more traditional version. In other words, you could kind of breed things to change them to some degree. You can only do that by taking them out of nature, and there's a limit to how far you can get, and that difference collapses if it goes back to nature, right? This argument for the limits of variation, I like to think of as kind of like evolutionary bumpers. I don't know if you've ever been out bowling. I'm sure most of you have. You ever been out there where they put the bumpers up for kids? Like, I like bowling and I take my daughter every once in a while. The bumpers are really fun. The bumpers basically rise up and prevent the ball from getting off the track, right? So the limits of variation, you think of as like bumpers. The idea is like the ball can move a little bit, right? But it stays in the lane, right? All species can vary some, but they'll never become a different species, because there's a limit to variation holding it in. What sets the limit of variation? Harder to say. Something about the way that maybe God created creatures or not, but it was generally believed by virtually everybody that it was real, because it was generally accepted that there was tons of evidence that when you bred something, there was a limit to how much you could change it, and that when you stopped trying to actively intervene, it would revert back to its original type. Okay. Now, Darwin, as I said, picked up the second volume of Lyell in South America on his way to the Galapagos. And it's important to know that his grandfather was, Darwin's own grandfather was an important theorist of evolution. And he had already encountered Lamarck a little bit by way of one of his professors in college. But it's important to note that Lyell was responsible for putting fresh in Darwin's mind the theory of evolution that advanced by Lamarck. And Lyell turned Darwin back to the question of evolution, despite the fact that the whole point of putting Lamarck into the principles of geology was to try to refute the case he makes. So I want you to remember what Daniel Dennett said about natural selection as a universal asset. The theory of transformation, on the one hand, advanced by Lamarck, and the scale of deep time, these vast scales of time that Lyell was arguing for that made big changes possible through small shifts, had a similar total effect on Darwin's thinking. They kept eating away at Darwin, making it possible to conceive, to look around the corners, to kind of break down the bumpers of thought that had been sort of pursued by previous naturalists. A universal asset indeed. So for Thursday, to really get at the sort of alternatives to this kind of thinking, the scale of the imaginative texture that Darwin would bring to this problem in his own work, we'll turn towards Humboldt in our reading for Thursday. Humboldt was in some ways a romantic naturalist, enraptured by nature and its order and beauties. But this is enough for now. I look forward to talking about all of this with you next week, and I hope you're having a great weekend out there. Bye.